We saw him as America's conscience, the perfect, noble man whose kind eyes on screen soothed millions. But forget that image. The real Spencer Tracy saw himself as a cursed monster. When he learned his son was born deaf, he believed it was divine punishment for his own filthy sins. Hollywood's greatest actor hated his craft, despised his Oscars, and locked himself in seedy hotels, fading away in empty mansions to erase his identity. And his legendary long-term affair with Katharine Hepburn was no fairy tale. The great actress became his secret nurse, hidden away like a backyard secret, not even allowed at his funeral. Today we'll dissect Hollywood's darkest myth and uncover how the nation's conscience turned his life into a solitary torture chamber. In this story, we won't dig through dirty laundry or count empty bottles. We'll do what Tracy himself forbade in life. We'll peer into his soul. We'll unravel why his descent into despair was not a vice for him, but the only available remedy for unbearable shame. We'll see how guilt over his son turned his acting talent into a tool for self-torment. And we'll understand why his great love with Katharine Hepburn could only exist in a realm of secrecy, pain, and sacrifice. This isn't a star's story. It's the anatomy of a man who became great despite his own desire to disappear. Act 1. Unwilling Deity. Why the greatest actor hated his craft. To grasp the black hole that consumed Spencer Tracy, we first need to shatter the main myth about his career. Film textbooks and memoirs from awestruck colleagues paint him as a genius who breathed on screen as naturally as others sleep. They call him the actor's actor, a benchmark no one could touch. But if you could peek inside his mind while the makeup artist powdered his broad, wrinkle-ridden face, you'd see not creative ecstasy, but a deep, gut-churning disgust. Spencer Tracy didn't just dislike his work, he was ashamed of it. Ashamed like one is of a disgraceful disease or a hidden vice. This shame rooted itself in his Irish Catholic upbringing and the notion of masculinity burned into his generation's psyche. In Tracy's world, a real man smelled of sweat, machine oil, or earth. A man built bridges, fought in trenches, or at the very least unloaded freight cars. A man created something tangible. And what did he do? A grown, stocky guy with the look of a dock worker, he made a living by wearing other people's clothes, painting his face, and faking emotions he didn't feel in front of the camera's glass eye. To him, acting was high-paid prostitution, a job that demeaned a man's dignity. He felt like a fraud, deceiving honest folks. They paid him astronomical sums for what he considered clowning. The more they paid, the more he felt he was selling his soul to the devil for gold dust. He loathed the film set's atmosphere, the hustle, the fake smiles, the endless takes. He felt physically suffocated in the world of illusions. This deep conflict between who he wanted to be, a simple, honest laborer, and who he was, a Hollywood star, spawned his unique acting method. Film scholars call it great naturalism, but it was really a form of psychological defense taken to the extreme. Tracy intuitively decided, if he was cursed to do this woman's work, he'd reduce the acting element to absolute zero. He refused to act in the usual sense. He didn't want to be caught pretending, so he just stopped pretending. He'd show up on set, hit his mark, and do everything possible not to look like an actor. He ditched any theatrical gestures. He lowered his voice to a normal conversation level, driving sound engineers crazy as they moved microphones closer. He'd cut entire chunks of dialogue if he sensed the slightest falsehood. His famous advice to young colleagues, "Just learn your damn lines and don't bump into the furniture," wasn't the genius's coyness. It was an honest confession from a man who wanted to do his job quickly, quietly, and without fuss, to get home and forget the shame. But here, fate's cruel irony kicked in. The camera, a ruthless tool that hates overacting and loves truth, adored his approach. Trying to hide, trying not to act, Spencer Tracy achieved an effect others spent years training for. His desire to be unnoticed, his restraint, his heavy, weary gaze of a man tired of it all, created an effect of frightening reality on screen. The audience didn't see a character. They saw a living person, thinking, doubting, and suffering right there and then. His silence on screen weighed more than other stars' monologues. His hatred for the craft transformed into incredible stage truth. He was so convincing precisely because he didn't care how he looked. He wasn't seeking the camera's approval. He ignored it, and that snapped the trap shut. The world fell in love with this non-acting. Critics put him on a pedestal. Colleagues like Humphrey Bogart or Clark Gable looked at him with reverent awe, understanding they were working, but Tracy was existing. Yet for Spencer, every rave review was a whipslash. They said, "You're a god," but he heard, "You're the most skilled liar among us." He found himself in a no-win situation. He couldn't quit movies because it was the only way to support his family, and we'll talk about this financial bind later. But he couldn't love it either. He had only one choice. Every morning don the mask of a sullen professional, step under the spotlights, and hate himself for being so good at lying. But this professional hell was just the surface layer of his tragedy. The real nightmare, which finally broke his self-belief and turned life into endless atonement, awaited him not in the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer studios, but in the nursery of his own home. Act 2. Sentenced in the Cradle. Fatherhood as a life sentence. If professional shame was a dull, constant toothache for Spencer Tracy, then what happened in June 1924 was an axe blow, splitting his life into before and after. This was ground zero, the epicenter of a nuclear blast, its radiation poisoning the next 43 years of his life. To understand why this strong man withered in gilded cages, you need to peer into the cradle where his firstborn, John, lay. That summer, young Tracy wasn't an icon yet. He was a poor, ambitious actor who, like any father, saw the birth of his son as his greatest triumph. John was supposed to be his continuation, his better version, his contribution to immortality. But soon, unease settled in the house. Louise, Spencer's wife, started noticing oddities. The child wasn't startled by thunderstorms, didn't turn his head at a dog's bark, slept through noise. The climax of this nightmare became a legend in biographies, but for Tracy, it was the harshest reality. Left alone with his son, he decided to test his suspicions in the most desperate, crude way. Spencer approached the crib and slammed the door with all his might. The crash should have woken the dead. But little John didn't even flinch. He continued to sleep peacefully in his absolute, impenetrable silence. Doctors delivered the verdict quickly and ruthlessly: nerve deafness, incurable. Spencer Tracy's reaction to this diagnosis is the key to his entire psychology. An average person in such a situation feels grief, confusion, fear for the child's future. Tracy felt something else, something far more destructive. He felt confirmation. Raised in the harsh dogmas of old Irish Catholicism, where suffering is always penance for sin, Tracy instantly constructed a monstrous cause and effect chain in his mind. He didn't see his son's deafness as a genetic glitch or a twist of fate. No, in his mind, it was a direct punishment from God. But not a punishment for the child, a punishment for him, the father. Tracy was convinced that his tainted blood, poisoned by alcohol, lustful thoughts, and pride, had physically transferred to his son. He believed he had broken his child. He was the toxic source that had crippled an innocent soul. This thought became an obsession, bordering on madness. I sinned, and he pays the price. God struck him where it hurt most, depriving his son of voice and hearing, so Spencer Tracy could never forget his own depravity. This belief erected an invisible but impenetrable wall between father and son. Spencer began to avoid John. From the outside, it looked like the callousness or indifference of a busy star. But in reality, it was a form of self-flagellation. Tracy physically couldn't be near the boy because every glance at him was like looking into a mirror that screamed, "You're guilty!" He loved his son with a painful, agonizing love, but believed his very presence was toxic to the family. While his wife Louise performed the heroic act of motherhood, spending hours teaching John to feel vibrations and speak, a story for another time, Spencer chose the path of cowardly escape. He decided the only useful thing he could do was become a money-making machine. He turned his guilt into dollars. He paid for the best doctors, teachers, built clinics, but stayed away, locked in his office or on set. At this moment, Spencer Tracy stopped being just a man and became a hostage. He forbade himself happiness. How could he laugh? How could he enjoy success when his son was forever trapped in a soundless world because of him? Any joy felt like betrayal. This internal sentence demanded punishment. And since God, in Tracy's view, had already passed judgment, Spencer decided to be his own executioner. He found a tool that allowed him to temporarily mute that unbearable voice of conscience and slowly kill the hated body carrying bad blood. That tool was the bottle. Act 3. Booze as an escape from his own skin. For most folks, the word alcoholic conjures up a picture of a weak-willed soul chasing cheap thrills. But with Spencer Tracy, that label demands a whole new perspective. His drinking wasn't a vice in the usual sense. It was a brutal, complex necessity, a medical procedure he couldn't live without. Booze served as the only anesthesia for a man undergoing open-heart surgery without any numbing, a surgery called living with guilt. His benders had nothing to do with the wild parties of the Roaring Twenties or Hollywood's glamorous soirees. You'd rarely catch Tracy with a champagne flute surrounded by giggling starlets. In public, he often made a show of sipping milk or ginger ale, feeding the myth of his ascetic lifestyle. But inside, pressure built like steam in a boiler. When the gauge hit the red zone, when the shame of acting on set and the pain of his deaf son became unbearable, he vanished. They called it going into a tailspin. The mechanics of it were frighteningly predictable. Tracy would check into a hotel, not the fancy suites where he might be recognized, but nondescript rooms where he could hide. He'd barricade the door, draw the curtains, crafting an artificial night to escape the accusing brightness of the sun. And then he'd drink. He'd down whiskey by the crate, not for the taste, not to savor the bouquet. He poured it down with the precision of a man swallowing pills to end it all. His goal wasn't to get drunk. His goal was to erase himself completely. He needed to kill Spencer Tracy, the righteous Catholic, the nation's hope, the perfect husband he saw as a lie. He craved darkness and silence in his mind. Witnesses who stumbled upon Tracy in the throes of these binges, usually paramedics or studio fixers, painted a scene worthy of Goya. They often found him stark naked. A psychoanalyst might see this as a desperate attempt to shed all social roles, costumes, masks. Naked, drunk, yelling at invisible foes, smashing furniture. In those moments, he ceased to be America's conscience. He became a wounded beast. In that state, he was finally honest. He unleashed the monster he believed he harbored inside. But the most chilling part of this tale was the industry of lies that fueled his downfall. MGM built an entire system to protect their prized asset. Special cleaners, led by the legendary Eddie Mannix, tracked Tracy down in any dive, bribed cops, paid for shattered hotel mirrors, and erased any evidence of his madness. This created a monstrous split in reality. Morning papers would headline Spencer Tracy's brilliant portrayal of another noble hero or his donations to orphans. Meanwhile, the hero himself, tied up in bedsheets, was secretly whisked out the back door of a hotel to a private clinic, detoxed, and made presentable again. Tracy loathed himself for it, but he also knew that without these breakdowns, he'd either lose his mind or end it all for real. Alcohol let him blow off steam, endure a little death, so he could resurrect with a monstrous hangover and don the mask once more. His physical suffering after these binges, shaking hands, gray skin, nausea, felt like deserved punishment. By enduring the physical toll, he felt he'd atone for some of his sins, earning the moral right to live a few more months as a respectable man. Yet fate had a trial in store for him, one worse than any hangover. The world decided to reward him for the very mask that caused him the most pain. The Oscars awaited their hero, ready to turn his life into a gilded cage. Act 4. The Golden Curse. Oscars for a Saint's Mask. If booze was Spencer Tracy's escape hatch, then his career triumphs were the chains dragging him back to a pedestal he loathed. The cruel irony lay in the roles the Academy chose to canonize him for. Tracy didn't snag top honors for playing complex, broken villains where he could legally unleash his darkness. No, Hollywood crowned him for portraying men of crystal clear, almost biblical purity. It was twisted, psychological torture. The peak of this absurdity hit in '38. Spencer Tracy took on the role of Father Flanagan in Boys Town, not a fictional character, but a real Catholic priest who dedicated his life to saving troubled teens, giving them a home and hope. Consider the context. A man who saw himself as a killer of his son's future, a man eaten alive by guilt over his deaf firstborn, had to play the perfect father to hundreds of other kids. On set, Tracy had to deliver monologues about how there are no bad boys, how love and patience could heal even the most wounded soul. Each line was a gut punch. He spoke words he desperately wanted to believe, but couldn't apply to himself. He felt like a thief, stealing a saint's robe to hide his shaking, hungover hands. When the Academy handed him an Oscar for this role, making him the first actor to win 2 statues back-to-back, Tracy wasn't just unamused, he was horrified. For most actors, an Oscar is a nod to their craft. For Tracy, that golden statue was a formal certificate of his hypocrisy. It seemed to whisper, "You've fooled us all so brilliantly. You've made us believe you're kind, wise, and saintly, though you know who you really are." Success became proof that deceit was his only virtue. There's a famous tale that Tracy insisted on sending his Oscar to the real Father Flanagan in Nebraska. For decades, the press and biographers spun this as a gesture of incredible humility and respect for the real-life inspiration. The public swooned, "What a noble man!" But through the lens of his psychology, a different picture emerges. It wasn't humility, it was disgust. Spencer Tracy couldn't physically keep an object in his home that burned his hands. The statue was a silent rebuke, evidence of his duplicity. By sending the award to the priest, he wasn't giving a gift, he was ditching evidence. He was returning sanctity to its rightful owner because he felt like an imposter. These awards slammed the trap shut. Tracy wasn't just a popular actor anymore. He became a national treasure, America's moral compass. Producers realized audiences wanted to see Tracy as reliable, just, monumental. They stopped offering him roles that might shatter that image. He was entombed in a golden sarcophagus of his own reputation. The world applauded his mask, while the man beneath it suffocated, unable to be himself. He had to live up to it. He had to keep the facade. And the higher the public's adoration climbed, the deeper he sank into self-flagellation. The only person who might have shared this burden was his wife. But here too, Tracy had painted himself into a corner. His wife was too perfect for him to feel alive beside her. Act 5. A Saint in the Shadows. In any Hollywood tragedy, the role of the alcoholic's wife usually fits one of two molds. She's either the silent victim, swallowing her tears into a pillow while her husband runs wild, or she's the cold fury, nagging the genius without grasping his delicate soul. If Louise Tracy had fit either mold, Spencer's life might have turned out differently. He might have found a reason for divorce, or at least an open rebellion. But Spencer's tragedy was that his wife was flawless. Louise Tracy wasn't just a good woman, she was a saint. And it was this sainthood that became his most secure prison. When doctors delivered the verdict on their son John, the couple's reactions were as opposite as the North and South Poles. Spencer, as we know, saw it as a mystical curse and drowned himself in despair. Louise, however, performed a feat that seemed impossible in the 20s. She refused to accept the medical belief that a deaf child was doomed to silence and isolation. While Spencer wallowed in self-pity and Act 6, The Woman Who Stared into the Abyss, Katharine Hepburn. The tale of Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn is perhaps the most beautiful and deceitful myth of Hollywood's golden age. Glossy magazines and nostalgic documentaries sold us a story of equals united, an intellectual duel between two greats, chemistry that ignited the screen. They painted a romantic picture, two titans finding each other in a world of deceit. But scrape off the gold leaf and look at the facts with a sober, almost clinical eye, and you won't see a Romeo and Juliet story. You'll see the tale of a troubled patient and his chief nurse in a locked ward where outsiders are strictly forbidden. Their meeting on the set of Woman of the Year in '41 should have ended in disaster by all logical accounts. They weren't just different people, they were representatives of warring biological species. Katharine Hepburn embodied everything that scared and irritated Tracy. A Yankee aristocrat from New England, daughter of a doctor and a suffragette, a woman with sharp cheekbones, a sharp tongue, and a Bryn Mawr degree. She wore pants when it was a societal challenge, took cold showers in the morning, and spoke with that lockjaw accent that triggered class hatred in the simple Irishman Tracy. At their first meeting, she looked him up and down and remarked, "I'm afraid I'm too tall for you, Mr. Tracy." Spencer Tracy was her complete opposite, a brooding, stocky Catholic, son of a truck salesman, convinced a woman's place was in the kitchen or church. He saw Hepburn as sexless, arrogant, unnatural. He even suspected she was a lesbian, so much did her behavior clash with his patriarchal standards. Yet this polarity became the key to their bond. At that moment, Tracy was in a deep crisis. He was tired of his saintly wife, tired of his guilt, tired of endless pretense. The women around him either idolized him or, like Louise, crushed him with silent Christian forgiveness. Hepburn did what no one else did. She looked him straight in the eye and saw neither the god of acting nor the father of the nation. She saw a scared, confused boy trapped in the body of an aging, drinking bulldog. And that gaze changed everything. For Katharine Hepburn, saving Spencer Tracy became her life's main project. It was a paradox feminists of the time couldn't solve. Why the most independent, emancipated woman in Hollywood, a symbol of freedom, chose to be a secret wife, an eternal lover, and essentially a servant. The answer lies in Hepburn's own psychology. She came from a clan of winners, where weakness was despised and problems were solved with action. She was used to being strong. But strength needs an outlet. In Tracy, she found the perfect subject, a crumbling monolith. She saw in him a tragedy worthy of her efforts. She knew about his dark hotels. She knew about the binges. And instead of judging or moralizing, she learned to work with it. Katharine literally took charge of his demons. She didn't try to fix him with prayers like Louise. She acted pragmatically. She made sure he ate. She dragged him out of bars. She sat by his bed for hours when he shook from hangovers, holding a basin while he vomited. She listened to his drunken rants about being worthless. For Spencer Tracy, Katharine became the only safe zone on the planet. With Louise, he felt like a sinner at the altar. With Katharine, he could just be a sick man. It was a colossal difference. She didn't need his money, she was wealthy herself. She didn't need his status, she was a superstar. This freed him from the provider role he hated. With her, he could afford the luxury of being weak, capricious, and imperfect. But the price Hepburn paid was monstrous. For this man, she consciously amputated part of her ego. On set, she remained a queen, but as soon as cut was called, she became a shadow. She adjusted her schedule for him. She cooked his meals, crouching by the fireplace. She tied his shoelaces when he grew too fat to bend over. She stopped attending social events because he hated them. This was a love built not on romance, but on deep compassion and complex codependency. Tracy needed a nanny he could respect. Hepburn needed a man for whom she could sacrifice her independence to feel needed. She embraced his darkness. She agreed to live in it. And this unspoken pact, "I'll be your support and you let me stay," became the foundation for 26 years of life. However, to be completely honest with history, we must consider another version of this script. A version whispered in Hollywood back rooms then and loudly debated by biographers now. What if Katharine's great sacrifice and Spencer's strange distance were explained not only by his struggles and guilt? There's a theory that turns their tragic romance into the perfect lavender marriage. A union where each served as the other's beard, a reliable cover from the harsh morals of the time. Look at the facts from this angle. Katharine Hepburn was always surrounded by rumors of her indifference to men. She lived with companions, wore men's suits, and behaved overtly asexual. Spencer Tracy, in turn, often found himself in the company of young men during drunken binges, and Hollywood's famous fixer, Scotty Bowers, claimed in his memoirs that he supplied the actor with gigolos. If this theory holds, the puzzle fits frighteningly well. Their relationship becomes not a story of sick love, but a story of brilliant, mutually beneficial partnership. For her, an affair with a married man who can't divorce was the perfect alibi. It explained why she didn't marry and lived alone. "I'm waiting for Spencer." This phrase quelled any questions about her personal life. For him, having a woman like Hepburn by his side cemented his status as a heterosexual alpha male. Who would suspect wrong inclinations in a man loved by Katharine Hepburn herself? Perhaps that's why they didn't share a household. Perhaps that's why their passion on screen looked so safely intellectual without animal electricity. It was a friendship of two outcasts who found a way to survive in a system that destroyed anyone different. What was it really? The greatest platonic love of two broken souls? Or a cynical but life-saving cover for two people who couldn't be themselves? We'll never know the truth. They took it to their graves. But whichever version you believe, romantic or pragmatic, the outcome remains unchanged. Hepburn became for Tracy the only person with whom he could remove the mask. Whether it was the mask of the ideal lover or the straight man, with her he could just be. And it was this format, living in the shadows, living by schedule, living without the right to official recognition, that led them to that purgatory where they spent a quarter of a century. Act 7, Purgatory for Two, 26 years of love without rights. Now that we grasp the nature of their bond, whether it was a grand passion or a lifeline for two lonely souls, we need to dive into the mechanics of their daily life. And mechanics is no accident here. Maintaining this illusion for a quarter century demanded discipline akin to a military operation. Their existence lacked the spontaneity and ease we usually link with love. It was a life of strict isolation. Picture two of the planet's most famous people who, In 26 years, never once dined out together. Not once. They lived in a bizarre, fragmented world. Even when Spencer Tracy finally stopped living with his wife Louise, he never officially moved in with Katharine. He settled in a guest house on the estate of their mutual friend, director George Cukor. Katharine lived separately, but spent all her time with him. Yet spending time and living are different beasts. They had no shared home with their photos on the walls, no mingling of belongings. Everything was temporary, everything was make-believe. If guests or reporters came to Tracy, Katharine vanished. She'd literally slip out the back or hide in her car while the master gave interviews about his virtuous life. The cruelest and most telling ritual of this life was the weekends and holidays. This schedule was as relentless as a guillotine. From Monday to Friday, Katharine was his everything: nurse, cook, companion, secretary. She ensured he took his pills, cooked his steaks just the way he liked, endured his grumbling. But come Friday evening, Spencer Tracy would stand up, put on his hat, grab his bag, and leave home. To Holmby Hills, to his legal wife Louise. It was an act of twisted psychological sadism, aimed primarily at himself, but ricocheting onto Katharine. Tracy returned to his wife not out of love or longing. He returned to check in, to keep up appearances, to punish himself with boredom and guilt in a house he built but felt a stranger in. And Katharine Hepburn was left alone. Imagine that loneliness. Christmas, Thanksgiving, Easter, all those family holidays when the world pauses in cozy unity, Hepburn spent in an empty house. She knew the man she dedicated her life to was carving turkey at a table with another woman. She knew he was likely silent, staring grimly at his plate, but he was there. And she was here, as if she didn't exist. She never called him there. She never demanded, "Stay with me this time." She accepted the rules of a game where she was always number two. Why did Tracy do this? It was part of his internal deal with God. In his twisted mind, suffering was currency. If he divorced and lived happily with Katharine, it would be a sin of hedonism. But if he lived with Katharine, tormenting her with uncertainty, while tormenting himself with visits to an unloved wife, then everything was balanced. He paid for his happiness, or his peace, with humiliation and pain. This was the purgatory they built with their own hands. Katharine Hepburn, a woman who could have any man in the world, chose to be a secret for someone who offered nothing but his illness in shadow. She became invisible. And this invisibility became especially terrifying in his final years, as Spencer Tracy's body began to fail, and hiding the truth grew harder. Act 8, Crumbling Monument. By the early 1960s, time sped up for Spencer Tracy. Most actors age gradually: gray hair, wrinkles, shifting roles. But Tracy wasn't just aging, he was falling apart. In his early 60s, he looked like he was pushing 80. This wasn't just bad genes or booze. It was the physical toll of a 40-year war he fought within himself. His body finally stopped lying. Once, he could mask his pain with a calm facade. Now his flesh was a map of his suffering. Look at his later roles, like in Judgment at Nuremberg. What audiences and critics saw as the pinnacle of acting, the heavy wisdom of Judge Dan Haywood, was really a medical chart. His labored breathing on screen wasn't a dramatic choice. It was emphysema and heart failure gasping for air. His slow, shuffling walk wasn't a character's age. It was sheer exhaustion, unable to lift his feet. Those famous long pauses before his lines weren't dramatic tension. They were him scraping together enough focus to remember his script. Spencer Tracy wasn't acting anymore. He stopped pretending to be someone else. In his final years, he brought himself to the screen, a broken, tired man who understood everything but couldn't change a thing. This raw, terrifying authenticity hypnotized viewers. We saw not an actor, but the ruins of greatness, like watching an ancient cathedral crumble, both frightening and beautiful. Behind the scenes, a quiet battle for survival raged, led by Katharine Hepburn. By now, their relationship had transformed. Eroticism, if it ever existed, and intellectual debates were gone. Only medicine and endless care remained. Hepburn became the guardian of a dying lion. On set, she created a bubble of silence around him. No one dared raise their voice near him. She watched his every move, carried a thermos of tea, and set a chair the moment the director yelled, "Cut," so Spencer wouldn't collapse. She did everything to hide how bad he was. This was her last great role, the illusionist, maintaining the myth of the indomitable Spencer Tracy. She knew work was the only thing keeping him alive. If he stopped filming, he'd perish within a week from realizing his own uselessness. So she used all her influence to get studios to insure him, nearly impossible with his health, and cast him in roles. During this time, Tracy reached a strange, grim peace. His wrecked body was proof of the universe's justice. He always believed he was sinful, bad inside. Now his appearance matched his self-image. The bloated face, gray hair, frailty, he saw it all as deserved penance. He didn't fight the illness. He welcomed it like an old friend he'd been expecting all his life. But he had one final effort to make. He needed to play the last act of his drama. Fate handed him a script that let him say goodbye to life, to his craft, and to Katharine right in front of the camera, turning a feature film into a documentary farewell. Act 9, The Final Take, A Living Epitaph. Spring of '67. Columbia Pictures soundstages. They're shooting Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, but the set feels more like a vigil at a deathbed. Everyone, from the lighting crew to the makeup artists, tiptoes around. They all know it's a race against death. Spencer Tracy was in such bad shape that insurance companies refused to cover him for the shoot. In Hollywood, that usually means the project gets canned. No one gambles millions when the lead actor might not make it through the day. So Tracy and Katharine Hepburn did something that spoke volumes about their bond. They put their entire salaries on deposit with the studio as collateral. They literally bought Tracy the right to die working, not in bed. Filming went at a gentle pace. Tracy could only work 2 or 3 hours a day, and only before lunch. Katharine was always there, watching his breath, ready to catch him if he faltered. But once the camera rolled, a chilling transformation happened. The old man who could barely shuffle moments ago stood tall. That steely glint returned to his eyes. He gathered the last of his strength for one final fight. The climax of this film, in Tracy's life, was his character Matt Drayton's final monologue. The conservative father must accept his daughter's right to marry a black man and speak about love's power over prejudice. But anyone watching now, knowing the context, sees Tracy isn't acting. When he talks about love, about passion evolving into something greater, he doesn't look at the actors playing his daughter and son-in-law. He turns to Katharine Hepburn. In that moment, the wall of silence they'd built over 26 years crumbled. Tracy, who never publicly acknowledged their relationship, who hid in corners and felt ashamed of his attachment, suddenly spoke. Using the script as a cipher, he confessed. Listen to those words. If what they feel for each other is even half of what we felt, then everything's all right. On screen, Katharine Hepburn cries. And those aren't acting tears. The camera captures her face in close-up, twisted with genuine, raw grief. She knows Spencer is saying goodbye. He's telling her, "I love you," in the only language he was allowed to use, through cinema, behind a character's mask. He sums up their painful, strange, yet magnificent bond for the world to see, and no one in the audience even realizes they're witnessing an intimate rite. Cameramen said that after "cut" was called, a ringing silence hung over the set. No one clapped, many cried. Spencer Tracy walked over to director Stanley Kramer, put a hand on his shoulder and asked, "Well, did I do it, Stanley? Am I done?" These weren't just words marking the end of a shooting day. It was a report. He'd fulfilled his duty. He'd worked his talent to the last drop. He'd atoned for his sins through labor, as a good Catholic should. 17 days after filming wrapped, early in the morning, Spencer Tracy got out of bed, went to the kitchen for a glass of water, and collapsed. The heart he'd tormented with guilt, shame, and love finally stopped. But even his death became the final act of the drama he directed for himself and Katharine. Spencer Tracy's death on the morning of June 10, 1967, wasn't just a medical fact. It marked the final, most brutal act of the play he'd performed his whole life. Even in death, he forced the living to play by his rules of total secrecy and outward decorum. That morning, Katharine Hepburn was there. She heard the sound of a cup hitting the kitchen floor. She found his body. But what unfolded in the following hours revealed the monstrous inertia of their relationship. Instead of succumbing to grief, Katharine acted like a professional cleaner. She knew the police, doctors, and press would soon arrive. And most importantly, the family would come. She called Louise. She called Tracy's brother. And then, she vanished. Katharine Hepburn, the woman who had washed this man's socks for 26 years, who had pulled him back from the brink, who had bought him the chance to play his final role, packed her things and left the house before the official widow arrived. She couldn't be found there. Even dead, Spencer Tracy had to remain the impeccable Catholic. His reputation mattered more than her feelings. The funeral was the pinnacle of this hypocrisy. Los Angeles stood still in mourning. Newspapers emerged with black borders. The church filled with Hollywood's elite. By the coffin stood Louise Tracy, majestic, calm, accepting condolences with the dignity of a wife who had walked the entire path with her husband. The children, John and Susie, were there. The picture was perfect. The father of the nation had returned to the family fold. Katharine Hepburn wasn't at the funeral. She stayed home, alone. She knew her presence would turn the mourning ceremony into a social scandal, a farce. She didn't want to give tabloids a headline like, "Mistress weeps over coffin." She respected Spencer's script even after the director had left the stage. As she would later say, "I had no right to be there. It was their moment, not mine." This was the final, cruel irony of Spencer Tracy's fate. He didn't win. He lost his battle for the right to be himself. All his life, he saw himself as a fraud, deceiving audiences by playing heroes. All his life, he felt like a sinner, unworthy of his family. And his death cemented this lie forever. History remembers not the tormented, doubting man who hated his own face, but the granite monument of the father of the nation and the great man. He hid his true self so well that he succeeded too much. The world bought it. The world believed the mask. And the real Spencer Tracy, the one who cried into his pillow, who feared silence, who was with Katharine, disappeared without a trace, dissolved in the glossy myth. Spencer Tracy entered the textbooks as the conscience of Hollywood. Audiences believed him without question. If Tracy furrowed his brow on screen, it meant the situation was serious. If he smiled, there was hope. We look at him and see a rock. But the truth I've told today turns his greatness into a warning. His natural acting, which everyone admired, was a form of self-denial. His reputation as an exemplary Catholic rested on a torturous double life. His status as a great man built on denying his own feelings. The tragedy of Spencer Tracy is a story of how public morality becomes an internal executioner. He created the image of the right man, and that image devoured him alive. He never confessed, not to a priest, not to his wife, not to the public. The only confession he allowed himself encrypted in 100 of his roles. Watch them again, knowing his story. Look into his eyes in Judgment at Nuremberg, or Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. You won't see a character. You'll see a hostage staring at you from the depths of his perfect reputation, silently screaming from the loneliness we mistook for courage. Spencer Tracy's story teaches us that suppressed pain kills slowly, from the inside. He burned out because he feared his bad side. But in the Golden Age, there was a woman who chose the opposite path. She didn't hide her demons. She made them work for her. She turned her pain into rage, her character into a loaded gun. Betty Davis. She didn't hide her fury. She turned it into a weapon. She forged herself impenetrable armor to survive Hollywood's meat grinder. But in this breakdown, I tell the terrifying theorem of her life. Strength without vulnerability doesn't make a person great. It makes them utterly alone. Watch this video right now to see how the armor that saved her career robbed her of the right to live, and why Hollywood's Iron Lady envied those who knew how to be weak.